Miracles are such inconvenient events. They never happen when you want them to. We think about miracles, we pray for miracles, and they seem to never show up. And then we hear they show up someplace else, in some other place, with some other person. Makes us to begin to doubt that not only do miracles happen, but also whether the one who supposedly does these miracles even exists. In fact, it's a common problem that people have, especially as they get older, say into their teen years or into their early 20s, and they start asking questions and analyzing and evaluating. Kids have no problems with miracles. Any of you who've had kids or have been around kids, kids love miracles. Kids embrace miracles. Kids live in a miracle world, don't they? One of the things I loved about my kids when they were young is their openness and their embracing of miracles and the fantastic and things that go beyond what we can imagine. And you have kids like Clive telling crazy stories and his mind runs wild, right? In all these areas that we say, this doesn't happen in the natural world. But we can't spend our lives thinking like kids. It would be a problem for you if you spent your whole life thinking as a child. You'd have a difficult time making it through school, for instance, or making it through your job. If you thought and you spoke as a 4-year-old and as a 5-year-old, and you embraced these types of things. So what do? We begin to reason. We formulate questions. We implement analysis. We draw conclusions. It's important. It's crucial. What happens along the way is that as we make these evaluations and as we go through this questioning process, we begin to build a series of logic in our lives, what logicians would call syllogisms, and we take our lives and we begin to evaluate them against what we see happening around us. And so, for instance, we say, I don't see miracles. And in fact, miracles go counter to what the natural world is. So miracles don't happen. I can't accept that. The Bible is full of miracles. Let me say it this way. The Bible has miracles. I'm going to come back and address part of that later on. And so therefore, the Bible can't be accurate. The Bible is telling us things about things that happen that I have no experience with, that nobody has any experience with, to be honest with you. And you could ask many people around, and some people will say it's a miracle, and other people will interpret it in a different way. Say it's just a natural occurrence. And so we begin to go through this process, and the believer looks at something that might happen, like someone who has cancer, say, and then is treated and is healed, and we prayed for this person, and the believer comes out and says, look at this miracle that God has done. And the unbeliever looks at it and says, look at what modern medicine can do for us. It's nothing to do with God. It's simply what modern medicine can do. And in any other circumstance in the past, that person would have died. But we've been able to do this. And if you want to attribute it to miracles, it's the miracle of the human mind and its ability to figure these things out, right? But the actual event, it's not miraculous. So doubts then begin to creep into our hearts and into our minds. And we begin to ask questions and draw conclusions that draw us away from the possibility of any of these things happening. And what happens in the process is not only that our minds become corrupted, in a sense, as we look through this process, but our hearts follow, because we can't separate ourselves into one component or the other. We can't think in one way and not have it influence the way we believe and the way we feel. So as we begin to rationalize that these miracles don't happen, and I don't see them, and all this talk about miracles is just fantasy for the religious, it begins to affect our hearts. We begin to believe that, yeah, this is true. I can't grasp it, I can't see it, can't understand it, it must not have happened, so therefore, why should I have any type of emotional, psychological, spiritual connection to any of these things. The problem is the following. A corrupt heart can never see the one who does the miracle. Once your heart becomes corrupt, there's no way you're going to see the miracle worker. You've closed off the door when you go down that pathway. Jesus said this. He said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Jesus didn't say, "Blessed are the ones who have seen the miracles of God, therefore they have seen God." If you see the miracle, then you know God is real. He said, if your heart is pure, you will see God. Entirely independent. Miracles don't play any role in that statement. So the accusation, the thing that many people would say, if God would only reveal himself to me and do a miracle, or all the praying that you guys go through, when you pray for X, Y, and Z and nothing ever comes about, and God apparently did all these miracles in the past, but he doesn't do them anymore, right? So all this praying that you go through, if I could see something clear in my life, then I would believe. Because then I would see that God is real. That God actually does miracles and he intervenes in a very clear way. So if only this would happen, then I'll believe. But Jesus said, that's not how you see God. You see God by a pure heart. That's the connection. And as we go through this process of rationalization, rationalizing miracles, rationalizing our faith away, it corrupts our heart and entirely blocks us off from the one thing that'll help us overcome that. That is a pure heart towards God and an openness. Jesus, in fact, said that we are to come to God as what? As whom? As children. With the eyes of faith, with an openness to what God may do in our lives. In the passages that we've just read in Mark chapter 4 and 5, we have several miracle stories that if you read through them, you probably thought, nonsense. They're too fantastic, aren't they? I read them and I say, a guy who's demon-possessed and has upwards to 2,000 demons in him, gets thrown into pigs, these demons, and they run off a cliff. A girl who's dead comes back to life. A woman who for 12 years had hemorrhaging, would be the medical term, constantly bleeding, touched Jesus and was healed immediately. Makes no sense. And to my 21st century educated mind, I really say, how in the world are those things happening, and why don't I see them in my life? Our prayer time, not orchestrated by me, but our prayer time this morning and the things that you suggested that you wanted us to pray about this morning is this. What do we have? We have some stories here. And what we find, I think, is that Mark wants us to understand when he connects these stories together, he wants us to understand that there's a connection between experiencing the presence of God in a clear, unmistakable, even miraculous way. There's a connection between that and our belief and faith in him. Because in each one of these stories, if you followed along perceptively, as I encouraged you to do, you would see the connection between faith and what Jesus did. Story number 1, the disciples are out on the boat. What does Jesus tell them when they are afraid the boat's going to sink and they're going to die? He said, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" Jesus looks at them and he makes a connection very clearly. Your fear is because you don't have any faith. Story number 2. Story number 2 is about the man who was possessed by demons, a demon named Legion. And what do we have here? We have something surprising that happens in verse 6. We have the man possessed by a demon runs to Jesus. And in verse 6 it says, when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. The demon-possessed man recognized. And what I don't know here, and in my reading on this passage, many people I would disagree with, I don't really know what's going on. I think there's a problem in some sense. And here's my problem. When a man is possessed by a demon, is he ruled by them constantly? Or is it this man in his natural state in some way runs to Jesus? Because what would we normally expect? Pushing away from him. But here it's as if, even if he is in his demon-possessed state, is being drawn to Jesus. It's a sign of Jesus' superiority, as we've seen before. And what happens here, when he gets there, whatever's drawing him there, the demon being drawn to him, or this man recognizing that this is the only person who can release him from this and running of his own accord there, however he gets there, and the demon then says, why are you coming here to don't torment me, send me into these pigs, and then the rest of the story. Verse 18 comes back, and what does the man do later on? It says, as he was getting into the boat, Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And Jesus told him to go on. And what did he do? He went on and he preached throughout the 10 cities, the Decapolis, in that region about Jesus. Story number 3. I have it here 3a because we have here something that Mark does often in his gospel. He divides a story. So he starts off with story 3a where the leader of the synagogue, remember those same leaders of the synagogue who are against Jesus? We talked about them extensively in our previous sermons. So we have these guys who are against him. Maybe Jairus is one of them. But what happens when you're totally desperate and you know medicine's not going to help you? You start to reconsider your affiliations, right? And here's this guy who apparently is reconsidering his affiliations. Jesus, who was once someone he may not have associated with, at least his group would not associate with, and accused Jesus, attacked him. Now when he's desperate, this man comes to Jesus. He has no other option. He's heard great things from this man, and so he wants something. Jesus is the only one who can do this. So he comes to Jesus and he says that his daughter is ill. What happens next? Story 4. Jesus on his way, the crowds come around him, and we have this intermediate story. So we stop Jairus, he goes into another story, and again, read through Mark and you'll see this happens a lot in Mark. He starts a story and then inserts something else that happens and then comes back to the first part. This woman who's had this hemorrhaging comes, she touches him. She said this, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. Verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Because it was a touch of faith. That's clearly what is the difference, right? Others were touching him, but here is a touch of real faith. And Jesus recognized that in some way. His disciples said, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around and to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, because she knew she was healed, and she knew that she was desperate, and her only option in faith was Jesus. She had no other option. And so even if I can touch him, this is going to happen. She knew faith was connected to it. Jesus knew faith was connected to it. And there was this connection between the two of them that nobody else knew. So when she saw Jesus ask, she knew who he was talking about. She came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed. And then we come back at the end at Jairus' home, where they laugh at him when he says, she's only sleeping. And then he goes in and heals her. Verse 36. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, what? Do not fear, only believe. So it's pretty clear that when you look at all of these stories, what we have stories of kingdom faith. I'm going to tell you why I call this kingdom faith later on, but they're stories about faith and belief that have led people to Jesus, And Jesus has done something miraculous in them. They're wonderful stories. They're inspirational. They're uplifting. They capture our imaginations, but at the same time, they're problematic. They're worrisome. They're distressing. They induce doubts. They create in me questions and frustrations. I ask, where are these miracles now? Why don't we see these things now? My sister passed away some years ago at my age. We prayed for her. No miracle. I just shared with you a friend of ours whose son has cancer. We'll pray for him. Hopefully there'll be some progress. Hopefully medicine will help heal him. One of the things that they've done is they've had to remove a portion of that organ in his body, which is cancerous. Now, where would the miracle be? The miracle would be if the doctors came back and said, you know what? That whole portion is back now, spontaneously generated, just as it was before, with no cancer. That would be a proof of a miracle, wouldn't it? Then nobody could say, oh, it's just the modern medicine that's done that. Why doesn't God do that type of miracle? Not only provide healing, but entirely regenerate whatever was wrong, to say, see, this is the power that I have. These are the questions that I ask. A couple of years ago in 2019, a church called Bethel Church in Redding, California, had one of the assistant pastor's daughter at 2 years old died, surprisingly, unexpectedly. They called the ambulance came to the house, the girl's name was Olive. They tried to resuscitate her, they brought her to the hospital, nothing. She died on December 14th, 2019. The church, however, decided that they were not going to bury her, the family did. Instead, what they were going to do is they were going to spend uninterrupted time praying until she was raised from the dead. And so for days and days, they held nonstop prayer services. In fact, one of the passages that I saw that they repeated over and over again and they began to sing was Talitha Cumi. Talitha Cumi. Little girl, rise up. And you could see videos of them using this exact passage and imploring God to raise this 2-year-old girl, Olive, back to life. Imagine the heartbreak. Imagine being a mother. December 14th, 11 days before Christmas, and your 2-year-old daughter dies. You've already set up Christmas, right? You already have the presents, and you're excited because at 2, it's a wonderful time when you have a 2-year-old at Christmas. What a great time, because they can finally really grasp what's going on. And you see the excitement in their eyes, and that's gone 11 days before Christmas. Imagine the pain. Then they invest and they pray until December 20th, 2019, they finally decided that they were going to accept the fact that she had died. And they buried her 6 days later. Is that lunacy? Or is that faith? What is that? What's the connection between faith and miracles? Did the people who decided to have that type of faith, were they different than Jairus going to Jesus and saying, my daughter is sick? Did they have less faith? What do you think they thought about themselves when they finally had to bury her? What do you think about that poor mother who may have thought, I must not have had enough faith? It's my fault. Have you ever been there? Have you ever prayed and not gotten what you've been praying for? And you have even a precedent in the scriptures, and you begin to think, maybe it's my fault. Maybe the reason why this didn't happen is because I didn't have enough faith. Imagine going through that process as a young mother with a 2-year-old daughter. And I think one of the things that someone's going to ask themselves is, maybe I didn't have enough faith. And so therefore, in some ways, she's dead because I was not able to generate this miracle from God. We're accustomed to death. I don't think many of us would have thought about praying that way. To be honest with you, I wouldn't have thought about praying that way. When my sister died, I didn't pray to God that she would be resurrected from the dead there. When my father died a couple of years ago, I didn't pray, God, bring him back from the dead. Is that because I'm too rational? Is that because I don't have faith? Some people might say you didn't have enough faith. Is that true? Sometimes when I sit back and I analyze my life and I look at those examples, I would say to you, yes, I don't have faith. I've been drawn into the rational analysis and all of the history in which people die and they don't come back from the dead. So why in the world would I even pray that? I confess. Does that mean I don't have faith? Does that mean my faith is weak? Maybe. I don't know. I can't give you an answer to that. But it's something that I struggle with because miracles are rarely convenient. Miracles rarely happen when we want them to. I want to know, what do you think? Because we have examples in the New Testament where others recognized, for instance, that death is final. I've mentioned many times in our congregation when Mary and Martha went to Jesus about Lazarus in John chapter 11, they said, if you had been here, he would still be alive. Jairus is saying the same thing. They all knew that death was the end. I've said it several times. People look back and they say, the first century mind was willing to accept these types of miracles. So therefore, when people, this was just some type of medical issue and she came back to life and they attribute it as a miracle. My argument is that the first century world and the first century mind and first century people were much more used to and accustomed to death than we are. We're separated from death. What happens when someone dies? They might die in a hospital, in a sterile environment. They're wrapped. Other people often do this. In some places of the world, in the Middle East, we find that many times the family does this. I'll say even more so in the West, we are distant from death. We try to avoid death and keep ourselves away from death and away from dead bodies. But in many places of the world, death is much more common. And it's something that families have to deal with. We find this in the first century. They knew what a dead body was. The first century mind knew dead just as we know dead, and they may have known it just as much as better than we do because they faced it much more than we do. Time span, lifespans, and so forth were shorter back then. They were accustomed to this. They knew dead. So they told Jesus, if you had been here while there was something to work with, while he had some life in him, maybe something would have happened. But now he's dead. It's been 4 days. There's no way. They didn't believe in miracles either. And Jesus brought him back from the dead. What do you think? When you think about these passages and you think about your life and you think about faith and what faith means and how you categorize, how you quantify your faith, where do you stand? I want to wrap all of these things together and close this morning with this. I think one of the answers to this dilemma is found in the Bible, and it's something that April was suggesting earlier. We find an explosion of miracles in the Bible in Jesus' life. We find other miracles in the Bible which are astounding, right? But in terms of the sheer number of miracles in one particular time frame, I don't think you can find any other example throughout the Bible, except for maybe the creation of all things by God in the beginning, in such a short period of time, something miraculous occurring. Look at, for instance, at the example of Joseph. I've been thinking this past week, I can't think of one miracle in Joseph's life. David. I can't think of any miracle in David's life. These are two huge figures in the Hebrew Scriptures who lived lives normal like we did. They prayed, they faced problems, they prayed, and the problem was solved. Now, we can interpret that as a miracle, but in terms of like this extraordinary outside intervention into nature. We don't see that in Joseph's life. We see a man who, as I went through our series, was steady in his faith when things were high, when things were low, when he was in the pit, when he was left in prison. He didn't pray for miracles. He stayed faithful, and it was his testimony that got him out. When he was tempted, he didn't pray for a miracle to be removed from it. He stayed faithful, and it suffered the consequences when he didn't succumb. When there was going to be famine, he said, let's not just do whatever we want to and then pray for a miracle 7 years down the road, right? He said, no, let's begin to assemble all that we need to, and then we'll be prepared. And it's exactly what happened. So we see examples in the scriptures in which we don't have this explosion of miracles. Jesus' life is unusual. We have an explosion of miracles in a short period of time. And I think what we find going on here is an answer in part to this question. And that is, Jesus' life is intended in one way, in part, not entirely, but in part to remind us that what we experience in the natural world is not what it's supposed to be. Sickness is not what it's supposed to be. Death is not what it's supposed to be. And Jesus came to establish a kingdom and to show us, to give us a glimpse of how it was intended to be. And in his life, he conveys in all that he does, this is what you're missing. This is what I can offer you. That's why he told at the wedding, he said, why would my disciples fast when they have the groom here? Right? They're not going to, this is a glimpse of what it's supposed to be. The transfiguration of Jesus, which we're going to come to in a few weeks. The transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain of transfiguration. What is that? It's a glimpse to the disciples of this is what it's supposed to be. What you're living now, what you call natural, is not what it's supposed to be. Death is not what God intended. And Jesus comes in an establishing a kingdom approach to life. He gives us glimpses into what life is supposed to be. And we see this blossoming of miracles that go against what we see naturally, but are all related to what God intended from the beginning. No sickness, no death, a perfect relationship with Him. And Jesus overcomes these, and He gives us a glimpse into that. Now the question is, does God continue that beyond Jesus' existence? Yes, I think He does. We see it in the book of Acts. We see miracles in the book of Acts, for instance, in the disciples' lives. And we can see it even in our own lives, in ways that we interpret God working miraculously in our lives. And we say, yes, this is still going on. But then when we come and we say, but why aren't these things happening like they did back in Jesus' time? One argument that I would give to that question, to that position, would be, because what Jesus is doing is He's reminding you of what God intended all along. And we look back and we say, Jesus did those miracles because He's reminding us of the kingdom of God. And that God rules over death and He rules over sickness. And we look back at Him and we find faith and trust in what He has done and the miracles that He's done. And we don't expect today that we live in the kingdom. We don't expect that the 2-year-old is going to rise again from the dead. We expect dead to be dead. But we look back and we say, but it's not always going to be that way. How do you know? Because Jesus lived and He gave us a glimpse of what it's supposed to be. And He told someone like Thomas, blessed are those who have not seen and believe. You and me. As we look back and we say, this example of Jesus' life is what extends to us and what we can look in the future as being what the ideal is and where we should be striving for. And in the process, what are we called to do? To be pure in heart. To have a pure childlike faith. To challenge ourselves, myself, admittedly, to challenge myself. To pray more strongly, to pray together as a group, to do what Jesus said and keep coming and appealing and asking and having the faith that if we continue to ask, that God just may answer. But ultimately, in that process of me individually and us as a community coming together and resolving to live together and please God and purify our hearts, we don't need a miracle, because in that process of purifying our hearts, we see God. We don't need the miracle to prove God's existence, because it can't be proven in that way. It's given to us in other ways. And then every now and then, God inserts himself and says, hey, there's still things happening in your life that you can't entirely explain, and the professionals around you can't entirely explain. I just want you to be aware, I'm still here in the background. I may not be intervening like I was before, but you can look back at Jesus as what it's supposed to be, and you can see that I'm here with you constantly. And as you do that, and as you purify your heart, and as you purify your heart, and as you purify, and as I purify my heart, we see God. That's a kingdom faith. It's a faith that recognizes Jesus is establishing a kingdom and bringing us in some way along in this kingdom, that as we purify our hearts, we'll see him. I pray this week that you will see God in a very clear way. And it may not be in you making this big prayer and some big answer to prayer, some miraculous event. It may be. I have no idea. But what I do know is that the most common way of us seeing God is as we submit to him and purify our lives to him. In each one of these instances, we have someone who came to Jesus and simply said, I'm submitting myself to you. That's the first step. I submit myself to you. Jesus, we're going to drown. We submit ourselves to you. I'm full of demons. I come to you. I submit myself to you. I've been healed. I submit myself to you. I want to stay with you. Jairus, the leader, the Jewish leader, I submit myself to you. I have nobody else. I'm coming to you. The woman with the hemorrhaging, I have no other option. I submit myself to you, Jesus. If I can just touch his garment, I'm willing to submit all that I have to him. Each one of these is an example of an extreme submission, where we get to the point that Jesus is the only one that's important for us. And I think that, coming back to what George was saying, maybe we don't see these things because we're not willing to submit, and even if we did see it, we wouldn't submit the way that we should. So maybe the first step is each one of us throwing ourselves before God and before Jesus, his Messiah, and saying, I submit everything. And then maybe then we'll see God. Heavenly Father, we come to you. We ask, Lord, that you'd help us. As we read these passages, Lord, I confess they generate in me this anxiety as I ask, what is going on and why do we see this in our lives? And it just seems too fantastic at times. Forgive me for my lack of belief, Lord. Thank you for reminding me in my life and in my experience with you that you are true, that you are real, that you are present. I thank you for the many, many ways that you've shown this to me. And I pray, Lord, that you'd help me to continually submit to you, that my faith would grow and that I would see the working out of your kingdom in my life. And Lord, that when I doubt, when we doubt, that we might look back and say, why do we not see today what Jesus was doing back then? Maybe it's because Jesus was just trying to remind us in one way. And let me correct that. Not just trying to remind us, but Jesus was emphatically reminding us that this is what he offers. That this is the way it's supposed to be. And Lord, help me do all that I can to submit to that and to preach about that and to draw people to that, what you've intended for us from the beginning. Lord, help us to be about that message this week and preaching that message, and let it change our hearts, miracle or not, as George said. Let us change our hearts that we might give our lives to you regardless of what miraculous events or we see around us. Lord, that this would be our first step, the step of submission. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you for watching this week's sermon in our series on the Gospel of Mark. If this is the first time that you're here with us, welcome. We hope that you will like our channel and subscribe. We hope that you will respond to us. You can contact us through email. We'd love to hear your feedback. Leave comments in the video. And we hope that you are enjoying the series, and we'd love to hear from you how the Lord is working in your life through this series on the Gospel of Mark. God bless.